In 1954, a man arrived at Tokyo's Haneda Airport with a routine business trip in mind. But when he handed his passport to immigration, everything changed. His documents were real, but there was one massive problem. His passport was from a country that didn't exist. He claimed he was from Taurid, a place he had always known, but no map, no globe, and no atlas showed any trace of this mysterious nation. The man was calm, insisting he'd made trips to Japan before, even showing entry stamps to prove it. But how could someone travel from a country that wasn't real? The more they pressed him, the stranger things became. Who was this man? Was he part of something bigger? Or simply spinning a story that still has people scratching their heads today? Well, let's find out. July 1954. On a regular sunny day like any other, an ordinary flight landed at Tokyo's bustling Haneda Airport. Among the many passengers stepping off the plane was a man who, at first glance, appeared completely unremarkable. He was Caucasian, well-dressed, and carried a briefcase just like any other traveler in the sea of people flowing through the terminal. But as this man made his way through customs, something happened that would turn this routine day into an unforgettable mystery. As officials at the customs desk casually flipped through his passport, their expression shifted from routine to perplexed. His passport was genuine, stamped, worn, and clearly well-traveled. But there was one problem. The country listed on the passport was Taurid. The officers exchanged confused glances. None of them had ever heard of such a place. They scrutinized the document again. It had all the markings of an authentic passport, but there was no record of Taurid on the map, or any world map for that matter. The man, however, was completely unfazed by their reaction. He was calm and composed, as if there was nothing unusual about his nationality. When asked to show Taurid on a map, he did so without hesitation. His finger landed squarely on the region between France and Spain, where Andorra is located. But then, his calm demeanor started to crack. To his disbelief, the officers informed him that the country he called home, or Taurid, was missing. He insisted that Taurid has existed for over 1,000 years. To him, the absence of his homeland on the map was not just an oversight, it was impossible. The customs officers weren't sure what to make of this strange situation. The man's conviction was unsettling, but his story didn't add up. Yet, everything else about him seemed ordinary enough. There was no reason to dismiss him entirely. After all, his briefcase contained currencies from several European countries, and his passports had stamps from airports all over the world, including from previous visits to Tokyo. Still, the more they pressed him for answers, the more questions surfaced. In an attempt to get to the bottom of the mystery, the authorities decided to detain him for further questioning. They placed him in a nearby hotel under constant guard while they worked to verify his story. But their investigation only made them more confused. The company he claimed to work for had no record of him. The hotel where he insisted he had a reservation had no booking in his name. Even the business he said he had traveled to Tokyo to meet had never heard of him. It was as if this man had materialized out of nowhere, bringing with him nothing but contradictions and a passport from a country that didn't exist. Then, things took an even stranger turn. Later that night, when officials went to check on him in his hotel room, they were met with a scene that defied explanation. The room was empty. The bed was untouched, and there were no signs of struggle, no indication of how he could have left. The room was several stories up, with no balcony, and the window was locked from the inside. There was simply no way for him to have escaped. Yet the man from Taurid had vanished into thin air, just as mysteriously as he had appeared. The authorities were left baffled. How could someone disappear from a locked, guarded room? The man, his passport, and his strange story had all vanished without a trace. No clues and no trail to follow. But as bizarre as the story sounds, people have come up with all sorts of theories to explain the strange encounter. Let's take a look at the ones that might just help us make sense of the mystery man from Taured. One of the most captivating ideas behind the Taured mystery is the concept that the man may have slipped into our reality from a parallel universe. According to this theory, Taured is a real place, but not here, not in our world. Instead, it exists in a parallel dimension, a universe where its history spans 1,000 years and its borders stretch between France and Spain. To the man, Taured was as real as any other country. His confusion and frustration when he couldn't find it on our maps were genuine. And just as strangely as he appeared, he might have returned to his universe, slipping back to the reality where Taured exists, kind of like the universe correcting itself. It's the kind of theory that's been gaining traction in recent years. While the concept of parallel universes once belonged solely to the realm of science fiction, it has slowly steered into mainstream scientific discussions. But that theory might still sound very sci-fi for most. There's also a theory that places the man not in another universe, but in another time. According to this idea, the man from Taured didn't come from a different dimension, but from the future. In this version of events, some believe the man's confusion stemmed from his accidental travel to a past version of our world where Taured had yet to come into existence. Just like how in the Bible the country of Ethiopia wasn't mentioned in the Old Testament, but the kingdom or city of Cush was mentioned multiple times, which ended up being the country of Ethiopia. So maybe right now, Taured is still in its infancy and will become a country in the future. Another prominent theory shifts away from science fiction and focuses on a more grounded, albeit equally mysterious possibility: espionage. What if the man from Taured wasn't a traveler from another world, but a spy working undercover? In this scenario, his passport, documents, and story of Taured were part of an elaborate disguise, crafted to support his fake identity as he moved between countries on covert missions. The apparent inconsistencies in his story, the country that doesn't exist, and the untraceable job could all be explained by his work in intelligence. The Cold War was filled with multiple John and Jane Doe. Corpses of multiple people were found, but no one could determine who these people were, their names, or their nationalities. They usually had multiple passports from different countries and different currencies, which made determining their actual nationality hard. It's like they came out of nowhere, just like the man from Taured. So it's possible that he could be a spy or an agent. According to this theory, the man's sudden disappearance from the hotel wasn't a supernatural event, but rather the result of a well-executed extraction. Perhaps his government, realizing that his cover was blown, swooped in and took him away before officials could dig deeper into his false identity. For those less inclined to believe in time travel or parallel universes, there's the more practical theory that the man from Taured was simply a smuggler using fake documents. His passport listing a country that doesn't exist may have been a cover that he used before to slip through international borders unnoticed. Taured was likely a fictional place he invented to avoid detection. Smugglers often operate using forged documents, assuming identities that allow them to move contraband across borders without raising suspicion. The unusual passport might have been crafted to exploit loopholes in the customs process. His vanishing from the hotel room in this theory could also have been the result of a carefully planned escape. However, if you ask me, I don't quite buy any of these theories surrounding our mystery man on the internet. For one, they've left us with more questions. Secondly, if I saw something like this on BBC, no shade of course, I would immediately want to hear what the skeptics had to say. Some critics have pointed out flaws and questioned the legitimacy of the Taured man. Let's see what they uncovered and see how their arguments stack up. On July 29, 1960, something strange was brought up in the British House of Commons. A case that could have been ripped from a spy thriller. As the discussion of border control and passport formalities continued, one name grabbed everyone's attention: John Allen Kuchar Zegras. I'll summarize the meeting, but you can read the full thing in the description below. At that time, Zegras was being prosecuted in Japan for carrying a fake passport. He claimed to be an intelligence agent for Colonel Nasser and a naturalized Ethiopian, but his passport said he was from a place called Tamanrasset, supposedly the capital of a nation called Taurid. Despite his confidence, no country called Taurid or any language that matched the writings on his passport could be found on any map. Yet somehow, Zegras had managed to travel the world using this passport, crossing borders without raising suspicion. His passport, written in an indecipherable language, bore an unofficial-looking seal with the gibberish phrase, Rish Ubwai Aktra Negusi Habesi Trop Turapa. To most, it seemed official enough. And for years, he moved flawlessly between countries, getting the better of the authorities. Media outlets and reporters soon picked up the news from all over the country. The headlines read, "Man from a parallel universe shows up at a Tokyo airport and suddenly vanishes." So here we are left with two mystery stories of men who seem to exist and not exist at the same time. First, we have a similar story to our mystery man. A few years after the strange ordeal and his escape, we have a new case of John Zegras. And similar to the Taurid man, Zegras' story fell apart when Japanese authorities began fact-checking his outlandish claims. Arrested and brought to court, his ruse collapsed under scrutiny of the Japanese authorities at the airport, and he was sentenced to a year in prison for illegally entering Japan and passing bad checks. Newspapers had a field day with the story. In August 1960, one article captured the public's imagination. John Allen Kuchar Zegras, a man with a flair for deception, wanted to travel the world and impress officials along the way. To do so, he created an entirely fictional country, complete with a capital, a people, and a language. Using a handmade passport stamped from the imaginary land of Taurid, south of the Sahara, he successfully traveled through the Middle East, gaining respect wherever he went. Claiming to be a naturalized Ethiopian and an intelligence agent for Colonel Nasser, he had traveled across the Middle East using this fake passport, and if anyone doubted him, they were shown the nonsensical proclamation beneath Taurid's seal. It was all a giant fabrication. Yet it somehow worked until Tokyo. But the mystery didn't end there. Later reports from a Japanese radio broadcast in 1961 revealed that Zegras wasn't just forging passports, he had also been cashing bad checks. He had arrived in Japan with his wife, a South Korean woman with a legitimate passport, and tried to cover their expenses with fraudulent money. For a while, everything seemed fine. Zegras moved around Japan, but soon things started to fall apart. He ran into financial trouble and began cashing counterfeit checks, eventually racking up around 200,000 yen. That's when the authorities closed in, but by then, the case had already spiraled into something worse. Zegras now claimed to speak 14 languages and spun wild stories to investigators, saying he was a naturalized Ethiopian and a secret agent working for a US intelligence agency and an Arab organization. But as expected, none of his claims checked out. No one knew where he was from, or if any of his past was even remotely true. The Tokyo District Court on the 22nd of December 1961 sentenced John Allen Kuchar Zegras, a man without nationality, to 1 year imprisonment for having illegally entered Japan and passing phony checks. Zegras, a self-styled American who has professionally acted as an agent for the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Central Intelligence Agency, had entered the country in 1959 on a bogus passport. But something unexpected happened right there in the courtroom. Another report said, and I quote, "On the 10th of August 1960, Yomiuri Shimbun, the mystery man who tried to smuggle himself into the country, attempted suicide immediately after sentencing." When the judge handed down his sentence of 1 year in prison, no one could have predicted what happened next. Zegras suddenly stood up, pulled out a shard of broken glass he'd somehow hidden in his mouth, and slashed his arms. He shouted that he was going to end his life as guards quickly rushed in to restrain him. The courtroom descended into chaos, and he was swiftly taken to a hospital. His wife, who was just 30 at the time, was sent back to South Korea, leaving Zegras alone to face the consequences. In a turn of events, the sentence wasn't too long, as Zegras had spent some of his time in detention. Once his prison sentence ended, Zegras disappeared from the public eye. No one knows where he went or what happened to him. Did he start another new life? Perhaps under another name, in another invented country? We'll never know. The man who fooled the world with a passport from a country that didn't exist was gone, leaving behind nothing but curiosity and the haunting question, who was John Allen Kuchar Zegras really? Over the years, the story of John Zegras evolved from a straightforward case of fraud into something far more extraordinary. What began as a legal battle over a forged passport gradually turned into a legend, with new fantastical details that blurred the line between fact and fiction. People started adding elements that never happened, like Zegras frantically pointing out a 1,000-year-old country missing from modern maps, or escaping from a heavily guarded hotel room, vanishing into thin air. This transformed Zegras from a common criminal into a mysterious figure who, some claim, crossed dimensions. As time went on, the myth grew even more convoluted, with names and places tied to Zegras' story varying from one retelling to the next. One particularly curious detail is the reference to Tamanrasset, a name that's real but not as magical as some might think. Tamanrasset is both a city and a province located in southern Algeria. It's home to the Tuareg people, a nomadic Berber group that has lived across the vast stretches of the Sahara for centuries. Interestingly, Tuareg also refers to their language as part of the Berber language family, making this piece of Zerig's tale more grounded in reality than the wild narrative it has become. The mystery man from Taurid may have vanished without a trace, but he's not the only strange traveler out there. Next up, we're diving into the bizarre case of John Titor, warning us about world wars and economic status that actually happened. If you're into time travel or just curious about what came to pass, you should definitely watch this.